The honourable member for Desnethe, Mississippi, Churchill River has 5 minutes for right of reply.
Madam Speaker, Marcy Chaw. I'd like to start by thanking my colleagues in the House for the dutiful consideration of my bill and for sharing their thoughts on making National Indigenous Peoples Day a statutory holiday. I'm very much looking forward to continuing our discussions in the near future as we work together to do what's right for Indigenous people across Canada. Madam Speaker, the discussion that we're having, that we've heard today, is part of centuries-old conversation about how we make time for Indigenous, for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people in our country. Historically, we know that the federal government's position has been that there is no time for First Nations, Métis, or Inuit people. For governments in the past, Indigenous people were to be civilized, educated, or eliminated. History has proven past governments wrong. Indigenous people have become stronger. Our recent conversations about the time for Indigenous people have focused on reconciliation and how we commemorate the leaders who have committed genocide. Apologies were made. Canadians have heard the stories of survivors. Canadians have heard apologies from prime ministers. They have heard the lack of apologies from religious leaders. And they have heard the promise of a government saying that they'll do right by Indigenous people now. Reconciliation is our government's word. Reconciliation is our government's promise. Reconciliation is the burden of government and the burden of settlers. And while the government should be having that conversation about reconciling Canada's past, Indigenous people are thinking about their future in Canada. We're asking different questions. We're slowly moving away from asking, how will we survive? And instead asking, how will we thrive? What we're seeing now is a renaissance of an Indigenous culture, Indigenous arts, and Indigenous languages. Indigenous leaders and movements from the past are being taught in history classes. Indigenous people are thriving in business, in science, technology, in justice, and in health. I have seen with my own eyes how our cultures and languages are growing in our communities and how our families and youth find strength in our traditions. There is still so much work that our government needs to do for Indigenous people who are suffering. But First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people have done so much for a society that has and continues to try to ignore them. And to be clear, Madam Speaker, my bill does not ask to give Indigenous people the time to perform their trauma. I'm not asking to give Indigenous people the time to accept our apologies while we atone for our actions. I'm not asking to appropriate an established Indigenous holiday so that settlers will have another day off work. I'm asking if we as the Government of Canada will give up part of our own time so that Indigenous people across this country can celebrate that makes them truly unique. Madam Speaker, it was in the spirit of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action that I proposed my bill. I believe that people in Canada are capable of mourning the legacy of residential schools while also thinking optimistically about the future. That is, after all, what we do every year on Remembrance Day. It's vital that we remember those we lost in residential schools, that we honor the survivors, and that we never forget about the Canadian government, how the Canadian government tried so hard to get rid of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. But the stories that Indigenous people are telling now are far more optimistic and think so far into the future that they refuse to be defined by the impact of residential schools. Let us not limit the future of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people to only a settler narrative of past injustice. Let's put an end to our government's practices of defining Indigenous people by the things settlers have done to Indigenous people. Let us listen to the generations of Indigenous people who stand up every year on June 21st and continue to survive and continue to celebrate who they are and who will they become. If we are truly committed to reconciliation, it is our duty to think that about the time of celebration that Indigenous people have created for themselves. Indigenous people have told us for decades that the 21st day of June, the summer solstice, is their day of celebration. I hope that when the members of this House vote on this bill, they will show that they're listening. Merci, Joe. Thank you.
The question is as follows. Ms. Jolibois, seconded by Ms. Moore, move that Bill C-369, an act to amend the Bills of Exchange Act, the Interpretation Act, and the Canada Labour Code, National Indigenous Peoples Day, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Heritage. Does
Does it please the House to adopt the motion?
No? Que tous ceux qui appuient la motion veulent
That those who support the motion please say yay.
opposed to the motion will please say no. Conformément à l'article 80.
In accordance to Standing Order 93 of the regulations, the vote is will be held on Wednesday just before private members' business.
Du jour,